All right.
No, they'll pick it up right there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
All right. When did you start?
All right, so what is your name?
My name is Leroy boehlke.
And when were you born?
I was born in June of 1925.
Do you know where you were born?
Yes, I was, in fact, we were sitting on part of the farm yet. I was born on the farm here in Germantown. And the farmhouse I was born as part of it is a park now. And my brother lives there, and I was born at that time. We didn't go to the hospital yet. That was 1925. I was born right there in the house.
All right. Can you tell us what your early childhood was like?
Well, as I say, I was born on the farm, and Germantown and neighboring little place we call Freistadt were very much settled by German immigrants from Germany starting in 1839. And of course now we were in the 1920s, and both Germantown and Freistadt over here in Mecklenburg were very much German communities yet. And when I learned to speak until I was 6 years old and went to school, we actually talked to German at home here, which was common around here. And I didn't learn to speak English until I was 6 years old. In 1931, I went to school at this Freistadt was strictly a church community, and went to the school there, and then I learned to talk English. And at that point, that again was common around here by the time we got into the 1930s. There were now automobiles around, which meant we were not so isolated as we had been all these years when you had to go by horse and buggy. Now you could go to Milwaukee, there was Interchange Milwaukee. So it was common that the parents here were concerned about their kids growing up talking German. So from that point on, when I started school and my brother started school, they didn't talk German anymore at home. They talked English. Well, they would talk, especially if relatives would come over or something, there would be some English, German yet. But no, they switched it to English to make sure that the kids now would grow up American.
Let's see. So when did you start school?
I started school in 1931 when I was 6 years old. That was typical at that time. And they had a church here at the Freistadt, the church, but only 7 grades at that time. That changed later. Then they had 8 grades, still do.
Okay, so where did you go to high school?
Well, Germantown at that time didn't have a high school. So I went to Menominee Falls High School. And of course that was long before there was busing. So what we did, my older cousin Verona, living up the road, she started high school there, and they gave her a car to drive, and then neighborhood kids, there were more of us, would drive, and then when she graduated in 2 years, then I drove, and after me my brother drove, but that was typical. The neighbors would get together, and at that time there was no problem with driving at 14. But I remember when, well, I had to get a license, and the Washington County Sheriff came, and we were standing outside by the car, and he was riding on the hood of the car, and he asked Dad, can the kid drive? Oh yeah, he says he's been driving truck and tractor, that was common, on the farm, and he's been driving out, and the sheriff said, okay, he wrote me out a driver's license, and away I went.
It's a lot easier than it is now.
Pardon?
It's a lot easier than it is now.
Quite a bit easier.
So you were born like right before the Great Depression?
Yes, yes.
Do you remember, did it affect you that much, or?
I will say not nearly as much on the farm because there was always work. You weren't out of a job ever. And you had food, you had milk. Yeah, there was hardly any money to spend. But we were much better off. And I remember through the 1930s, Uncle Dad would bring out relatives like Uncle Louis, who had him built us a car garage and corn bin, and my Uncle Gerhard, he remodeled the house, so there was the grandparents were living with us in the house. There was more room for them, so, and that's how some of the people in Milwaukee had to get by. There simply were no jobs. And relatives would help them out, especially if they were looking at farm relatives, and give them a job out there so they could survive. That's how it went.
Mm-hmm. So, where did you go to college?
Well, then of course, starting in '39, it was war in Europe. In '41, America got into it. I graduated in '43, and because I was on the farm and the government wanted crops and food to continue, I got a year's deferment for 1 year until '44. So instead of going in the Army as almost all of my classmates did in the fall of '43, I didn't go until the fall of '44. Now in '43, the winter '43, '44 was the Battle of Bulge. The Americans had invaded Germany, and most of my friends ended up, they got, at that time we had what was about 4 months of training, camp training, and then overseas you went. Most of my friends went overseas to France and marched right into the Battle of the Bulge. I was more fortunate coming a year later, '44, of course, in, now the war by that time was going well in Europe. Russia was making great strides, pushing the Germans back, and the Americans were advancing. So now they were concentrating on the Pacific. Of course, America was fighting 2 wars, one all over the Pacific. So then I got shipped, got put on a troop ship and sent to the Pacific Theater. The Philippine Islands, they had mostly been cleared, were just mopping up yet on the big island of Luzon. So but the Japanese were still very active out at sea. They had submarines all over the place, so we went a long way around. We headed south of the equator, went past Guadalcanal, up New Guinea, and then docked at Manila in the Philippines. And I joined the 1st Cavalry Division, which has been overseas from the beginning. I remember some of those fellas had been overseas for 4 years. But they were sending replacements, and we started training for the big invasion of Japan. See, this was 45 now. And I got there about February of '45, and we were on maneuvers on the landing craft. And one day we had just hit the beach, and there were tanks around, and all the ship whistles went off, and we didn't know what was going on. And they said, guess what? Japan has just surrendered. So that was in September of '45. And, well, they put it back in the boat, took us back to our camp. We were in tents out there in the jungle. And we spent all night taking down the tents. By morning, we were loaded on a truck right back out to the ship, and away we went for Japan. And I remember that took a couple of weeks, or at least more than a week. But anyhow, we were the 1st Cavalry Division, and that was kind of a favorite of MacArthur's. They had done good work in the Philippines. And so we sailed into Yokohama Harbor as the battleship Missouri was on our right, and there was MacArthur and the delegation from the Japanese Army signing the treaty. We went by them and headed for Yokohama Harbor and docked there. And then we were the first Americans on Japanese soil and stayed there for a week. Then we sent another former Japanese Army camp for a week. Then we got on trucks and went into Tokyo to the American Embassy, and our unit happened to be, there wasn't a whole division, only a small part of it, but our unit happened to be the unit that was there as an honor guard at the American Embassy as MacArthur raised the American flag. So that was a little special. We were housed then in a former Japanese Navy base on Yokohama Bay, and then I spent a year there. Our job in the occupation army, right there in Tokyo, and our job was to protect the Emperor's Palace and the shrines. There were valuable things in the shrines, so we would be usually out there one day off and a day on, day and night, taking turns standing guard at the shrines and at the Emperor's Palace. So then a year later in 44, 45, well, by that time I got to be 46, got home, I think it was in October of 46. I was hoping, now we started talking about college, I was hoping to get home by September because at that time it was a great blessing for me. If you had served in the Army a certain time, you could get free college education. So I was shooting for September 46. Didn't make it though, but I started then at the University of Wisconsin in Madison in this January of 47. I was able to start that semester, and they were understandably getting so swamped by veterans there that there was no room on campus to live. We lived at the Army base, Air Force base, at Truax Field in barracks for the first semester, and then they bussed us in every day. And then in the summer, I was able to, they had running full semesters in summer. I took the second semester then in summer, and then by September of the next year I was on schedule, and then I put in the other 3 years at the University of Wisconsin. I graduated with a bachelor's degree in business administration in 1950.
All right. Should we go with that?
Kind of going back to the war, what was your reaction to like the attack on Pearl Harbor when you first heard of it?
Well, I was home yet in high school at that time, of course. We all knew that was war, and we were, of course, in it immediately. And it was a terrible thing, but Japan had been preparing this for years, had a huge navy, and had conquered already at that time. They were mopping up in China, and then they went down to like Thailand and all those, and the Philippines, occupied New Zealand and Guadalcanal, and were making plans to attack Australia. Well, it was finally in Guadalcanal that the Americans, and most of the time out there with the help of the Australian Army, was counter-attacked. We did take Guadalcanal, we did take New Guinea, and worked our way up through some other islands too, to Philippines, and finally took that too. So yeah, the reaction was we knew we were in war, and that's the way it went.
Did you have like a certain role in the war? Like,
Well, as I said, I was in the First Cavalry Division. Now, at that time, they weren't a cavalry anymore. That was just their name. It's an old, famous division. Fought the Indians out west and so forth and so on. Didn't have cavalry horses at that time anymore. But it was now an infantry division. So I was in the 7th United States Cavalry Regiment, which is interesting too. If you ever heard of General Custer and his massacre, well, that was his regiment. But they were still active, and so I was in the 7th Cavalry Regiment. First, well, as I mentioned, I was standing guard. But then, of course, the war had ended in 45, so they were starting to send the boys home in 46, and our troop clerk was sent home, and I had taken typing in high school, and they needed somebody to run the typer, be what they called the troop clerk instead of the company clerk. So for the last 6 months or so, I was really in the office, being the clerk, had to make out daily reports and all that stuff.
Do you have any favorite war stories?
Well, no, that's pretty much it. I was never in. We were training in the Philippines, of course, for combat, and there were still some Japanese units active on the island, but the first Cav had pulled off the line to get ready for the big invasion of Japan. So I wasn't, don't have any big war stories.
All right. Well, then moving on to like where we were at the 50s.
Yeah.
How was like life in the 50s?
Well, the war's over in 45, and I got out of school in 50. And of course, my dad was still home on the farm. My brother was farming at that time. And when I graduated, I had to get a job. And it happened that at that time, the West Bend Aluminum Company was still active up at West Bend. So I got a job there. And I drove up every day. I lived home for some years. I drove up to West Bend. I got a job in the office, in the credit department, and I actually worked there for 10 years. Then I had a chance to get a job as a credit manager at Milwaukee Plywood that would have been 1960 or 61, maybe 62. But I got a job then in Milwaukee at the, and again in the office as a credit manager in what they called Milwaukee Plywood Company at that time.
Okay, so when did you get married?
Well, I got married in 1957 then to a local girl, Audrey Hansen, in church. Met her, we were in choir at church. And got married met her in 56, got married in 57. And then we built a house in Germantown and lived there, so I didn't move much. Once I got back out of the Army, I was here in Germantown and still am.
Do you remember the tension of the Cold War?
Well, yes, of course, it didn't affect me too directly, but it certainly was a part of our life. Russia ended the war, and this, I would say, we mostly didn't know that. Getting it from the newspapers and stuff, we knew the powerful war machine that Hitler had built. Starting in about when he took over power, 1932, 33, he had about 8-9 years. He turned the country around. There was a lot of, after World War I, a lot of unemployment in Germany. There were hard times. He put everybody to work in war factories, built the best tanks in the business, built the best artillery in the business. He had the best airplanes in the business. He had a war machine like nobody had. When you see pictures of what we had in 39 and 40, you have to laugh. Our tanks, they were antiques. And it took us years, and England was no better. France was no better. So when Hitler, one by one, picked them off, Czechoslovakia, Poland picked just the next, Austria, France was no match for him. Nobody had an army. It took us years to build something. And the Russians were no better. And it was 1941 when Hitler invaded Russia. And in 6 months, they had captured, they had destroyed the Russian army of over 1 million men on the border, captured a lot of them. And they spent that winter like about 70 miles from Moscow. They were just unbeatable. But what we didn't know is that both Hitler and Stalin saw this coming for a while. It was in 40, they met and they had a peace treaty and they were going to be good friends and they divided up Poland. But they both knew what was going on. Russia was arming like crazy. They moved all the big factories 1,000 miles east past the Ural Mountains. And so that even though Hitler got as far as Moscow, in a matter of 6 months, and had destroyed most of the Russian army, he hadn't captured their factories, and we helped Lend-Lease Russia. We had to come up through Iran, Iraq, through the back door. We helped them with trucks. We gave them our old useless tanks and stuff, but in the meantime the Russians were building new ones, big ones. And by the time they got to 1943, well, by 43 they had stopped, and well, Hitler didn't even bother to attack Moscow real hard. He had an oil problem. Sure, they got oil from Romania and stuff. He needed a lot more than that. So he turned his attention, went south, attacked Stalingrad, and Russia did have, but it was never given much attention. They had a little war with Japan at that time. So they had a big army out there in the east. And now with 41, now Stalin could be certain that the Japanese was worried they were going to attack him somewhere. He knew they weren't going to do that now that they had started no more in the Pacific. So he could move that army in from the east, and they were what helped save Stalingrad. And from about, 41 was 42 was pretty much a stalemate. By 43, and the other thing, of course, with that first winter of 42 was another bad. Russian winters can be terrible. That's what beat Napoleon when he attacked Russia, and he got beaten, had to come back. That winter was terrible, and the Russians, having just fought a battle with Finland, knew what it was to fight in the winter. They had their tanks made so they could go on snow. The Germans couldn't. And so they kept up the pressure over the winter, attacking when all the Germans could, and the Germans had advanced so fast and so far, their men had no winter clothes, no winter uniforms. It was a terrible winter for Russians. And then came spring, it was the mud. And there again, the Russians could move much better on the mud than the Germans could. So they were able to hold the Germans, and Hitler with his big push heading south, coming in the back way to the oil fields there in the Middle East. And he did get all the way down to the mountains at Iran, Iraq. But again, the Russians were they were starting to hold, and then by the time the next year it turned around. Russians were on the attack, and from that on, the Germans were going back. And by that time, within 2 years, the Russians had better tanks on the field than the Germans, as good as they were. They had better planes in the sky than the Germans, and they had artillery that was a match for them, and from then on. But the trouble was with the Germans is that Hitler was mad. He was insane. When they finally got, he wouldn't let his armies retreat. When they were attacking Stalingrad, there was the Sixth German Army of hundreds, 400,000 men. The Russians had cut off supplies. Germans couldn't supply them, and the general was begging for supplies. He was running out of ammunition. Couldn't shoot. Couldn't do nothing. And the Germans, Hitler by that time, Hitler had simply demoted all the generals. He was in charge personally. He was commander-in-chief, and he didn't know the first thing about war. And so he just kept ordering his men to stand fast, don't give up. And of course they couldn't. When you're finding out ammunition, what are they going to do? So that whole army surrendered. And from then on, the Germans kept pushing back, and Hitler had troops down in Romania, Hungary, and stuff. And France, he could have brought them in, but no, stand fast. He was crazy. And they couldn't stand fast, and they lost. By 45, spring of 45, the Russians were all the way to the Oder River, into Pomerania and East Prussia, which was German soil. Across the Oder River, by spring they were in Berlin, and Hitler killed himself. So then the Japanese hung on yet that summer, and they surrendered in August. But that's the way the war went.
Do you remember the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Well, yeah. That was the other thing. They divided Germany, and Russia. My people came from eastern Germany. Pomerania was the state, and as the Russians invaded that in starting like February, March of 45, they cleaned it out completely. It was awful. It was horrible. They fought for their life for the Germans for 5 years, and they were bent on revenge. They took almost every old man, young man that was there. They either shot him or sent him off to slave camps. What happened to women, I won't even tell you. And Stalin, of course, knew what not everybody knew, that from now on Poland, Pomerania, Silesia, all that land was no longer German. It was going to be Polish. So they took the church books, burned them, brought in bulldozers, bulldozed the German cemeteries to kind of make the people forget that it was Germany for 700 years, you know. And so it got to be Poland, and it's Poland to this day. And then they got East Germany, and that, of course, they almost ruined through the communist system. The communist system, you got free education, you got free medical bills. There was no such thing as not having a job, everybody got paid. But it was a system that killed itself. They were giving the people more than they had money, and finally we talked to the world about all this time, of course, we had the Cold War. Because when the war ended, and there they sat, they had grabbed all this land, including East Germany. Why didn't Americans and English do something? Stalin had the biggest and best war machine on earth. And we were tired of war too. We didn't try to do anything about it. So he sat there and putting the pressure on the West, trying to beat him down with the Cold War. Finally, the thing that seems to have beat him was our science We had grabbed, what was his name yet? Fun something or other. The great rocket scientist, German rocket science. We moved all those guys over here. They developed our rocket science, jet planes, and now we had rockets that could go for 1,000 miles. And Russia wasn't able to keep up. We finally got to the point we could be threatening Russia. And so eventually they got, when it was at 89, the wall finally fell, and Russians were there yet for some time, but they pulled out. Then in the meantime, we were fighting war in Korea, and it turned out after that war that really the big thing behind it was Stalin. You figure, you Americans, better you fight Koreans than me. So, but that all finally got settled, and little by little with our technology, we were able to get the upper hand in the Cold War. But they built, you know, the war, you couldn't deal with them, you couldn't go to see their country, they were threatening with their big army there. But we had a big army in Germany too, so it never went beyond that, thank God. And yeah, the Cold War was a difficult time, because, well, and after that there was war in, what is it down there, not Thailand, the other word down there in the Pacific. But we went through all that, but all that was still pressure by the communists, you know.
Mm-hmm. So during the 50s, kind of going back here in all the media that started coming out, like television and stuff, do you remember?
Certainly changed our life, yeah. I remember first television, little black and white set. And of course that was followed by cell phones, and it completely changed our lives. Between used to be just radio, you know, and newspapers, and it got to be all television. And after that, communication pretty well, email, computers, cell phones, different world. It started in the 50s, 60s, 70s, all that changed.
Mm-hmm. So I know you wrote a couple books. So to kind of wrap it up, would you like to tell us about those?
Well, I got interested in, since our people had come from Germany in 1839 and later, and through Germantown and Mequon, and that was occupied, now part of it became Poland, and then East Germany finally became part of Germany. Got interested in history there. Yeah, so that wouldn't all be forgotten. I wrote a book about Pomerania and a book about Germany, and tried to keep, we have, and that was common. Milwaukee, of course, was, at that time was called the Athens by the late 1800s, because so many Germans settled here in Wisconsin and in Milwaukee. Athens of German Athens, because of the culture. For instance, the printer, what is his name yet? That was the biggest German printing company in Milwaukee in the world, bigger than anything you had in Germany. But of course that all changed too. Then after 1900s, the German immigration dropped off, and the Italians and the Polish and finally from all the world came. But for a time here in Germantown, and we had all these German events. In German, there were like 35, 40 German clubs in Milwaukee alone. We still have the Hessen Club here in Germantown. We have the Pomeranian German Club in Mequon. Lots of big German clubs, the Schwaben and the Bavarians and so forth and so on, the Rhenish Rhine in Milwaukee, and we have German Fest. So the German culture is still alive, and to try to remember where we came from and why we came, yeah, I did write a couple of, not big books, but little booklets explaining the history.
All right. Thank you for your time.
Well, it was fun. I think I talked way too long. But
It doesn't matter.